Greetings and welcome back to our journey, the Marco Polo drive of peace, culture, and sustainable development. And I hope you can see behind this iconic site, this UNESCO heritage site, the Maiden Tower. I'm standing in the old city of Baku, Azerbaijan, an ancient city with a remarkable history, a place that has been part of so many empires and so much cultural, religious, scientific, military history through the ages that I'm very thrilled to be together with you in this place. Let's recount how we've gotten here. Our journey, remember, began in Rome. We went from Rome northeast to reach Venice, the hometown of the Polo family. From Venice, we headed east and we crossed the Balkan Peninsula. We went through modern-day Slovenia, then Croatia, then Serbia, and continued on to Bulgaria on the eastern edge of the Balkan Peninsula. And from there, we reached the great city of Istanbul, Constantinople, the great center of trade on the western end of the great east-west Silk routes. Constantinople was our jumping off point in history, and Istanbul, modern day Constantinople, our jumping off point for heading further east across the Anatolian Peninsula. And we hugged the coast of the southern Black Sea in a narrow stretch of low-lying plain just on the coast of the Black Sea, with the great Pontic Mountains to our back in the east-west range of Anatolia. We crossed Anatolia from west to east, stopping in iconic historic Silk route cities, Samsun and Trabzon, and we continued, of course, eastward. And reaching the end of Anatolia, we arrived in the South Caucasus. The South Caucasus is the region south of the Great Caucasus mountain range. That Great Caucasus mountain range today is the geographic division between Europe to the north and Asia to the south, so that when we crossed from west to east into the South Caucasus, we were staying in Asia. On the northern side of the Great Caucasus Ridge lies modern-day Russia. We reached Georgia, the capital, Tbilisi, first stopping in a wonderful port city, Batumi, a port on the eastern end of the Black Sea, continued to the capital, Tbilisi, and then crossed from Georgia into modern-day Azerbaijan to reach Baku. Baku is on the far eastern end of Azerbaijan. It's on a peninsula that heads into the Caspian Sea. So I'm standing just a few meters from the Caspian Sea right now, which is actually a lake. It's an inland sea. It's fed by the Volga River. It's actually the largest lake in the world, and it has an astounding proportion of the fresh water of all of the world's lakes. Something, I'm told, of perhaps a third to 40% of all of the lake water in the world. So the Caspian Sea, which is surrounded by countries including Iran, Russia, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan. So 5 countries surrounding the Caspian Sea. And we will, from this point, cross the Caspian Sea into Kazakhstan on the other side as we continue our journey. But today, we're so lucky to be in Baku. As I said, it's an ancient city. The Maiden Tower behind me is built in the 12th century AD, but it's thought to have foundations that go perhaps 1,000 years before that. Baku is known as the land of fires. This is very interesting and very relevant today. The land of fires means that this is a place where natural oil and gas seeps from the ground in this hydrocarbon-rich environment would have sustained flames. And that was a reason why Absheron Peninsula and this place, Baku, became a center of one of the world's ancient and most influential religions, Zoroastrianism, religion that dates back perhaps 3,500 years. And I mention it because probably before the Maiden Tower, there were temples with fire, with these gas seeps giving perpetual flames, which is a part central to the ritual of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is not only a phenomenally fascinating religion which survives today with a small following relatively in the world. It was a great religion in the ancient past, but it had a huge influence on Judaism and on Christianity as its doctrines spread from this region back to the Eastern Mediterranean, including when the Israelite exiles from that were taken to Babylonia returned during the Persian rule back to Jerusalem. And they carried with them Zoroastrian ideas when they returned. Zoroastrianism believes that the world is in a struggle between good and evil, and that it is the responsibility of each individual to choose good and to find salvation by choosing good. And we can see that that idea of free choice, the struggle of good and evil, of virtue and vice, or of good and sin, became very much central to ideas of Judaism and then Christianity. And so the historical influence of Zoroastrianism is likely very, very great in our history. But I want to talk about a later period of Baku as our central focus for our visit together today. And that is Baku as a core part of the Mongol Empire. Because a lot of our story of the Marco Polo drive, based on the Polo family venture from Venice to Kublai Khan's court in China and then back, is about the Mongol Empire, an empire that deserves superlatives in every conceivable way and helped shape history in fundamental ways. And Baku was part of the Mongol Empire and a very appropriate place for us to consider the Mongol Empire. Now, to start, the Mongol Empire became in the 13th century, in the 1200s into the middle of the 14th century, the largest contiguous land area empire in the history of the world. So superlative number one, it was the largest empire of contiguity ever in world history. At its zenith in the middle of the 13th century to the middle of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire was around 24 million square kilometers. Absolutely stunning to consider how big that is. The United States today is about 9 million square kilometers. Modern day China is about 9 million square kilometers, roughly speaking. The EU 27 is about 4 million square kilometers. So you could put the United States, China, and all of the European Union into what was the Mongol Empire in the 13th and the 14th centuries. And this was a vast contiguous area. Well, it's an unbelievable story to reach an empire of that scale, and an empire that at its peak had perhaps 100 million subjects under imperial rule, which constituted about 25 to 30% of the entire world population. How did that happen? Well, the story is remarkable, but I'll start with a piece of geography, including where we are. Azerbaijan, and stretching eastward across Anatolia and across the northern Caucasus, also to the east, really stretching from the plains of Hungary all the way to the Pacific Ocean, lies a band of dryland, a dryland called the steppe region. And the steppe region is a place where rainfall is around 250 to 500 millimeters per year. Not very much, but enough for grass. And it is largely flat. It is largely continuous, so that you can move in a continuous way across relatively flat terrain for around 8,000 kilometers of grassland. Well, who loves grassland more than anything? The horses. This was the great site of the wild horses in the ancient world. Incidentally, the Great Plains of North America would have also been the site of wild horses, but for the fact that when the peoples came from Asia to the Americas across Beringia, across today's Bering Strait, some 10 to 15,000 years ago, they hunted the horses to extinction. That did not happen in Asia. Thank goodness. That's why we have the horses today. And they thrived in this vast 8,000 kilometer steppe region. And within that region developed horse-based societies, societies that lived basically on the horse. They were largely nomadic societies living in drylands, not settled societies that would settle in one place, because they weren't, by and large, crop growing. They were pastoralists with their horses, with their sheep, their goats, and moving from season to season to follow the grasslands as the grasses grew according to the seasonal rains. And so the steppe region is a vast region that is filled with horses, that had relatively sparse populations, and that developed over the millennia many very important civilizations that were horse-based. Horses for every use, for transport, communication, herding, and of course for warfare, because it was in these horse-based civilizations where the horse was first domesticated and then turned into the modern tank warfare of the cavalry, but modern in the first and second millennia before the Common Era, so thousands of years ago, and were horse-based archers, provided absolutely formidable military capacity. And it's in that context of steppe-based pastoralist societies that the Mongol peoples lived and developed, and with their center in today's modern nation of Mongolia, and families of groups or of linguistic groups speaking Mongol dialects lived in this vast steppe region. Well, after lots of warfare among various clans and small polities, they united under a single ruler in the year 1206 AD. His name is Temüjin. We know him as Chinggis Khan in English, or more appropriately in Mongolian pronunciation as Chinggis Khan. Chinggis Khan became the great king, the great Khan of the Mongol people who united. And he was one of history's fiercest conquerors, perhaps the fiercest and perhaps the most successful conqueror of all of human history. And the Mongol warriors organized by Chinggis Khan into rigorous units with vast military skills of many sorts ended up creating this empire of 24 million square kilometers. Well, Chinggis went on many brutal campaigns, slaughtered peoples that were conquered in a way for psychological warfare to tell the others, you better surrender or else you will meet this fate. And under Chinggis Khan, who lived to the year 1227, so ruling for about 20 years, the Mongol Empire suddenly exploded and expanded in size and began to conquer a vast area in Eurasia. Chinggis Khan had 4 sons. When he died, his third son, Ogedei, became the great Khan. He was elected by the Mongol groups as the successor to Chinggis Khan, and under Ogedei, the empire continued to expand. In fact, by 1241, the Mongols had reached Hungary, and they were on their way to Vienna. In other words, the Mongols were on their way to conquering Europe and creating an empire that would stretch all the way from the Pacific in the Far East all the way to today's Europe. But in 1241, Ogedei suddenly died, and under the principles of Mongol rule, all the leaders of the Mongols had to return to the base, to the home, to elect a new chief. So almost by a miracle, the invasion of Europe stopped in 1241. They went back, and Ogedei's son, Guyuk, became the next great Khan, and he lived for another 8 years, spreading more conquest. One of the great conquests that was taking place was that the Mongols were starting to invade today's China. At the heart of China's population is not a grassland, but a temperate, well-watered, river-based society along the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers with tens of millions of people. The Mongols had a hard time crossing those rivers. By the way, the horses did not know how to cross the rivers, or couldn't cross the rivers, I should say, and the Mongols didn't know how to create pontoon bridges at the beginning and to have warfare across the rivers. So they conquered up to the Yellow River, the Jin people, but they continued to threaten southern China, the Song people. In 1248, I believe it is, Guyuk died, and the next great Han that was elected was the son of Chinggis Khan's 4th son, so a grandson called Mongke. And Mongke became the great Han for another decade and expanded the campaigns in all directions into what is modern-day Russia, into what is modern-day Iran, into what is today's China. Mongke died at the end of the 1250s, and there was division in the Mongol groups and a rivalry between 2 of Mongke's brothers, one of them, the protagonist of our story of Marco Polo, ultimately prevailing, and that is Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan in 1260 became the next great Han. He had to face another brother in civil war for several years, but Kublai Khan triumphed, and Kublai Khan proceeded to conquer the rest of China. And in the year 1271, he established the Yuan dynasty, which is the Mongol-led dynasty that controlled all of China. Well, our Marco Polo story fits in here because it was in around 1265 that the two merchant brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo, who had gone from their home of Venice to make money first in Constantinople and then crossing the Black Sea into Crimea, and then finding that because of some local conflicts, their way back home to Venice was impeded, decided to head further east, as we're doing, and found their way in today's Bukhara, a site we'll be visiting very shortly in modern-day Uzbekistan, where the Polo brothers met an embassy or an envoy of Kublai Khan, who had become the great Han by 1265. And this ambassador said, "You come now further east to Han Balik, to the capital of the Mongol Empire, modern-day Beijing, and meet with the great Han, Kublai Khan." And that's where our stories of this Mongol Empire, superlative in every way, and Marco Polo join. Of course, as we know, the two brothers stayed in Han Balik for several years. They were sent back by Kublai Khan to convey a message to the Pope, arrived back in Venice only to find that the Pope had died. They waited around for a new Pope to be elected. As we have told, the new Pope was someone that they had met who had been a papal legate or a papal envoy representative in today's city of Acre. And they carried his message back to Kublai Khan, this time with the son, Marco Polo. They arrived back in Han Balik to Kublai Khan's great court in around 1275, and they stayed in the court until around 1292, when Kublai Khan finally relented. He enjoyed their company. He enjoyed the services of Marco Polo as an ambassador and observer for him. He let them return to the West. Kublai Khan himself died 2 years after the Polos had left Han Balik. So Kublai Khan died in the year 1294. And when he died, the unity of the Mongol Empire basically fell apart. And this is very interesting because it fell apart in 4 different large blocks. One was China. The Yuan dynasty continued. The Mongol rule over China continued. The second great area was the homeland of the Mongols. The second great area, called the Chinggis dynasty, was the homeland of the Mongols, based in what is today's Mongolia. Where we are standing became a third part of this fragmented Mongol rule, and that was called the Ilkhanate. And it's basically the Persian region, the greater Persia, if one could put it that way, under Mongol rule. And the fourth area is to the northwest, and that was called the Golden Horde. And that was basically the area of today's Russia and Ukraine. And so the Mongol Empire, after 1294, fragmented into these 4 different areas: Yuan dynasty, the Chinggis, the Ilkhanate, and the Golden Horde. Each of those succumbed to its fate. The Ilkhanate relatively quickly, and this region fell again under Islamic, highly Persianized rule after the end of the Ilkhanate. The Golden Horde, which was the area of Russia, finally it was defeated by Russians who retook their lands in the 15th century. The Yuan dynasty lasted until 1368, when the Chinese Ming rulers retook China from the Mongols, and the Chinggis region of Mongolia, the home, lasted the longest into the 16th and 17th centuries. But essentially, the Mongol Empire, this 24 million square kilometer unity, had 1 century of very strong unity from around 1250 AD, when it reached its not full expanse, but on its way to conquering China and its full expanse, to around 1350, by which time it had started to break apart and actually to fully disintegrate, with various regions being retaken or conquered by other rulers. After the very brutal conquest, ironically, what had been the area of some of the most brutal warfare in human history became an area of peace. An area of peace because it was now ruled by one polity of 24 million square kilometers. And that peace is called Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols. And it was a place where you could travel safely over thousands and thousands of kilometers. It was a place of open communication. The Mongols invented a postal service. The postal service was what Americans came to know centuries later as the Pony Express. The postal service would carry messages by horse that would travel perhaps 25 kilometers at rapid speed and then be handed off to the next horse to travel at rapid speed and be handed off to the next horse, and in this way make a system of vast scale and unprecedented speed. And so the Pax Mongolica was an area of great east-west trade, of a flourishing economically once the conquests were over, and of vast communication and exchange of ideas as well. Because many of the leaders, including Kublai Khan and his successors, were patrons of science, of mathematics, of the arts, of religious tolerance. And so there was a huge spread of ideas, and many core technologies during this period traversed from the east to the west. Gunpowder, the compass, paper currency, paper making. And this was one of the transformations that enabled Europe to come out of its economic decline and doldrums, and eventually to assert itself and even achieve an economic dominance by the 19th century, with technologies that had come from the east during the Pax Mongolica. Now, we should ask, why did all of this end? And of course, one can tell a political history, one can tell a military history, but both the beginning and the end of the Mongol period seems to have a physical, geographical story attached to it, which is a little bit obscure, still a little bit debated, but seems to be very important. What the climatologists have found, for example, is in the decades leading up to the Mongol conquests, the rains were plentiful, unusually plentiful, and that meant that the grasslands were unusually thick, and that the horse populations presumably tremendously expanded. So the paleoclimatologists suggest that climate may have played a role in the rise of the Mongol Empire. And in the same way, nature may have played a pivotal role in the end of the Mongol Empire. I said that the Mongol Empire was reaching its end around 1350 AD. That's a major date in human history. Remember what 1347 is in European history. It's the year that the Black Death arrived to Europe. Now, the Black Death is caused by the pathogen Yersinia pestis, and it's a pathogen, a killer, that is carried by fleas. And the fleas bite rodents and both transmit Yersinia pestis and then are infected by Yersinia pestis. And it seems most likely that the Black Death arose in Central Asia, in the Mongol Empire, and because of this vast expanse of trade, was actually extended all the way to Europe quite rapidly because of this interconnectedness. In other words, there was a COVID pandemic in the 1340s that spread very fast and with extraordinary lethality. One theory is that it arrived via today's Crimea. One story is that the Mongols were battling the Genoans, who had an outpost in Crimea. The Mongols were afflicted with Yersinia pestis, with the bubonic plague. As they were dying, they used, it is thought, they used a biological warfare by throwing the infected dead bodies over the walls of the Genoan stronghold and spread Yersinia pestis, spread bubonic plague to the Genoans. The Genoans, of course, were the great merchants. They took their ships back to Genoa, and the Black Death emerged in Italy, in the Italian peninsula, in 1347 and spread throughout Europe till 1351 and killed around 1/3 of the European population. But the Black Death, we now understand, created havoc throughout all of the Mongol lands. And just as a favorable climate may have been a base of Mongol expansion, so a zoonotic disease may have been one of the key factors of the Mongol decline. So this is a story that is absolutely remarkable, and the legacy of the Mongol Empire remains with us today because the ideas that were transmitted east and west, the creation of the Silk routes of safety and trade that we are now following, what today is called the Middle Corridor, which stretches across Anatolia, into the South Caucasus, into the region that we will now visit once we move across the Caspian Sea to the east, into Central Asia, and then into China. That long corridor was a thriving region of culture, science, arts, after decades of merciless military conquest and destruction. But the legacy remains with us today. The fascination remains with us today. The knowledge of these events we owe in history originally to Marco Polo, who made the voyage we are on 750 years ago, carried the story back home, wrote a book that we still treasure and give us guidance for our common journey today. So thank you so much for being part of the Marco Polo drive of peace, culture, and sustainable development. We'll see you very soon in Central Asia.